I arrived to visit my daughter, but as soon as I crossed the gate, I felt a knot in my stomach. All her things were thrown across the yard, and from inside I heard my son-in-law's furious shout. "She just has to sign, and that's it. Why are you making me do this?" I heard glass break. My daughter let out a choked sob, and my grandson pleaded, "Don't hit my mom. I promise I'll be good." I didn't hesitate. I ran inside. I pulled him away from Sarah, and then I called his parents. "Get over here now. If you don't, the next call I make is to the police." 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang. But before we continue, please check if you are subscribed to Elderly Stories and write in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know how far our stories travel. I drove my old car to my daughter Sarah's house on a suffocating afternoon. I hadn't been able to reach her for 2 days. Every call went straight to voicemail, and my texts seemed to vanish into thin air. Sarah had never made me worry like this. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm down, but my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was hitting my chest. When I reached the street that led to her house, I had a bad feeling. The white iron gate, the one she always kept securely closed, was now halfway open, swinging in the hot wind. I parked the car, got out, and felt my legs tremble. I pushed the gate open and entered the yard, and the scene before my eyes left me breathless. The small garden, where Sarah cared for every flower and pot so meticulously, now looked like an abandoned dumpster. The floral dress I had given her last week, the frame from her wedding photo with her husband, and the teddy bear my grandson Ethan hugged every night, his most cherished possession. They were dirty. Thrown next to a broken bougainvillea branch, I stood motionless, my head spinning, trying to understand what was happening. Then, from inside the house, I heard Mark's shouts, my son-in-law, hoarse and full of fury. "You just have to sign it. Sarah, don't make me do this the hard way." Then I heard the sound of porcelain breaking. Between those noises, Ethan's sobs slipped through. "Dad, don't hurt Mom. I promise I'll be good. I won't ask for toys anymore." The boy's trembling voice pierced my soul. I heard Sarah's weak voice, almost begging. "Mark, don't scare Ethan." Her voice faded, choked by tears. I couldn't stand still for another second. I ran to the front door, banging on it hard and shouting, "Sarah, Sarah, open the door!" But the heavy wooden door didn't move. It was locked from the inside. Fear and rage mixed inside me like a raging fire. Without thinking, I ran to the back door that led to the kitchen. Luckily, it was only secured with a small wooden latch. I took a deep breath and slammed my shoulder against it with all my strength. There was a crack. The latch gave way and I almost fell to the floor as I entered. The living room looked like a battlefield, an overturned chair, pieces of porcelain everywhere, and in the middle of the chaos, I saw something that froze my blood. Mark was holding a fistful of Sarah's hair, pulling it violently, forcing her head back. My daughter's face was pale, soaked in tears, with a red mark on her cheek. Her eyes, which used to shine with joy when she saw me, now only showed fear and desperation. In a corner, Ethan was curled up, covering his mouth with his little hands, trying not to cry out loud. His big eyes, full of terror, watched the scene. He was only 5 years old, but his gaze was that of someone who had already seen too much suffering. I wanted to run to him, to hug him, but first I had to save my daughter. When he saw me, Mark stopped for a moment, surprised and furious, but he didn't let go of Sarah. The rage inside me exploded, so intense that the fear disappeared. I screamed with all my might, my voice breaking with indignation. "You bastard! Let go of my daughter right now!" I ran at him without thinking, scratching his arm with all my strength, my nails digging into his skin. I pushed him with all the force of a mother defending her child. Mark, stunned, stumbled back and let her go. I seized the moment, grabbed Sarah and hugged her tightly. Her body was shaking. Her breathing was shallow, as if she was about to faint. I turned and pulled Ethan towards me. My little grandson clung to my chest, sobbing nonstop. Standing in the middle of that destroyed room, with my daughter in one arm and my grandson in the other, I felt the world falling apart. Mark stood opposite us, breathing heavily, his eyes red like a cornered beast. He stared at us without saying a word, but in his gaze, there was hatred, a hatred so intense, it seemed to want to devour us. As I held Sarah's fragile, trembling body, I remembered the day I gave her away to Mark at their wedding. That day, the Chicago sky was clear, and sunlight filtered through the oak trees. Sarah was dressed in white, radiant like a sunflower. Mark, at her side, took her hand and looked at me with apparent sincerity. He promised me, in a firm voice, "Don't worry, ma'am. I will never let anyone hurt her. I will protect Sarah for the rest of my life." At that moment, I believed him. I thought my daughter had found a good man, someone who would take care of her just as I had always dreamed. I remember an autumn afternoon, 5 years ago, when Sarah brought Mark home for the first time. He wore a perfectly ironed white shirt and carried a basket of fresh fruit, apples, grapes, and some juicy oranges. He spoke softly and always held my gaze respectfully. He talked about his job at a financial firm, with a proud but humble tone. He spoke of his plans for the future, a small, cozy house, of the children who would one day run through the yard. When he took Sarah's hand and looked at her tenderly, he turned to me and said, "Ma'am, I love Sarah very much. I just want her to be happy." I smiled, nodded, and thought my daughter was very lucky. They married soon after. Sarah used the money she had saved after years of hard work to buy a little house in the suburbs. I contributed a part too. It wasn't much, but it was all I had after so many years of effort. Back then, Mark beat his chest and promised he would work tirelessly to pay her back, so she wouldn't have to carry a debt to her mother. I watched him paint the house mint green with Sarah, and I watched her carefully plant a bougainvillea vine by the porch, tying each branch with care, as if tending to her dream of a happy family. The day Ethan was born, I saw Mark awkwardly holding the baby in the hospital, his eyes full of tears. He hugged Sarah and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I saw my daughter's smile, a smile of true happiness. Everything started to change when Mark began to do well at work. He was promoted. He started wearing expensive suits and shiny shoes, but he changed with it. He came home late. Sometimes he wouldn't come back all night. His eyes were fixed on his phone screen, muttering about numbers rising and falling on the stock market. I remember visiting once and seeing him at the table, swiping endlessly on his phone, without looking at Sarah, who was trying to calm Ethan in her arms. She looked at him with sadness and disappointment, but just lowered her head in silence. Then the secret calls started at night. I heard Sarah tell me, her voice trembling, "Mom, I heard Mark talking to someone at midnight. He was saying something about money, about debts. But when I asked him, he got angry and yelled at me to stay out of it. I told her to talk to him directly, but deep down, I knew Sarah was already starting to be afraid. Little by little, the valuable things in the house began to disappear. The new television, the set of dishes I gave them for their first anniversary, even the gold ring Sarah had worn since she graduated. Everything was gone. Sarah lied to me, saying they were broken or lost, but I knew she wasn't good at hiding the truth. One day I pressed her to tell me what was happening, and she burst into tears, confessing she had sold her small car, the gift I gave her when she finished college, to pay one of Mark's debts. The car was badly damaged. It couldn't be fixed, she told me. But her red eyes and evasive gaze gave her away. I held her with a broken heart, knowing I could do nothing but be there for her. The breaking point came a few months ago. When Mark lost a large amount of money gambling online, he came home a different man, no longer the one who had once held Sarah's hand with tenderness. He demanded she sign papers to mortgage the house Sarah had bought with her own hard work, without him paying a single dollar. "Just sign it, Sarah," he told her in a soft, icy voice. "We'll get out of this. I promise I'll win it all back." But Sarah, for the first time in 5 years of marriage, said no. A firm, decisive no, though it was filled with fear. Since then, Mark turned completely against her. He started to humiliate her, calling her useless, a freeloader. He threatened to make her lose her job, to tell everyone she was crazy. There were nights when Sarah ran to my house, crying uncontrollably in my arms, and I knew everything had spun out of control. Once she showed me a copy of the divorce papers Mark had already prepared. In it, Sarah voluntarily gave up all assets and also custody of Ethan, leaving everything to him. I read those lines with trembling hands. The paper almost fell. "I'm so scared, Mom," she told me, her voice broken. "He says if I don't sign, he won't leave us alone, that he'll make me lose my job, that he'll say I'm crazy." When I finally got Sarah out of Mark's hands, I felt my chest would burst with rage and pain. I put Sarah and Ethan behind me, as if my body could be a shield to protect them. I looked him in the eyes, saw the hatred reflected in his, but I wasn't afraid. My voice turned cold, every word landing like a stone. "When you dared to put a hand on my daughter and my grandson, this stopped being your business." Without giving him a chance to respond, I took out my phone. Mark twisted his mouth into a sneer, as if he thought I was just threatening him. But my hand, though shaking slightly with rage, dialed the number very quickly. On the other end of the line was Mr. Richard, Mark's father. I didn't say hello. I didn't beat around the bush. I said it straight. "Mr. Richard, get to your son's house right now. I'm giving you 30 minutes. If not, the next call I make will be to the police." I hung up just as he was stammering to ask something, giving him no chance to argue. Mark froze. A flicker of confusion flashed in his eyes. He didn't expect me to be serious. He started pacing the living room, like a caged animal, sometimes punching the wall hard. The thuds echoed and made me jump, but I wasn't focused on him anymore. I just wanted to get Sarah and Ethan out of that place. I took mother and son to Ethan's room and locked the door. The small room still had the soft smell of the child's blanket, but the atmosphere was now suffocating. Sarah sat on the bed, silent, her empty eyes staring into space. Her face was pale, as if all the life had been drained from her. I knelt in front of Ethan and, with a damp cloth, gently wiped the smudge on his forehead, trying to comfort him. "It's okay, sweetie. Grandma is here with you now." But the boy's big eyes were still full of fear, as if he didn't believe the nightmare was over. I sat next to Sarah and took her hand. It was ice cold. Her slender fingers trembled in mine. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but my throat closed up. Through the crack in the door, I could still hear Mark muttering insults outside. Every word was like a knife. I hugged Sarah tight and whispered, "I won't let this continue, honey. I promise." But deep down, I knew that promise wouldn't be easy to keep. Mark was not someone who let things go easily. Exactly 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang, sharp in the silence. I heard Mark's heavy footsteps going to open it. Mr. Richard entered first, heavy set, his face scowling as if coming here was a huge inconvenience. Behind him was Mrs. Teresa, Mark's mother. She looked smaller than I remembered, her face drawn, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Seeing the destroyed living room, overturned chairs, scattered porcelain, the heavy air, Mr. Richard just frowned, and Mrs. Teresa let out a small gasp, covering her mouth. I opened the bedroom door and came out to face them. Sarah followed behind, her hand still gripping Ethan's. The boy clung to his mother's side, his terrified eyes looking at his grandparents. I didn't want to beat around the bush. I pointed to the yard, where Sarah's and Ethan's things were still piled up in the sun, the flowered dress, the wedding frame, the teddy bear. Then I pointed to the red mark on Sarah's cheek, the clear print of a hand, a silent accusation. Finally, I looked at Ethan, the child trembling, his little hands clutching his mother. My voice was clear, every word heavy as a stone. Look, this is the happiness your son promised he would give my daughter. Mrs. Teresa looked down, her shoulders shaking, not daring to look me in the eye. I saw her reddened eyes, but she said nothing. Mr. Richard was different. He crossed his arms and said in a dismissive voice, as if talking about the weather, "Men get a little heated. Fights between spouses happen. You're exaggerating. Let them work it out themselves." Then he turned to Sarah with a reproachful tone. "You probably said something to make him angry like this, didn't you?" Hearing that, my anger erupted like a flame. I trembled, not from fear, but from indignation. I stared at him and said with a voice of steel, "If you can't raise your son, the law will. I'm calling the police." He scoffed with a contemptuous laugh, a defiant smile. "If you're so tough, report him. Let's see if the police believe a mother-in-law, or a husband who says his wife was cheating, or about the debts." His words were a slap in the face. He dared to invent, to slander my daughter in front of me. I wanted to scream at him, to hit him, but I knew that would only make things worse. I realized that talking to these people was useless. They didn't want to see the truth. They didn't want to admit their son had become a cruel man. I turned to Sarah with a firm voice. "Honey, grab a few necessary things. We are going to my house right now." Sarah nodded, her gaze still blank, but she obeyed silently. I helped her put some of Ethan's clothes in a bag, and I grabbed a few of his favorite toys. Ethan stuck to my legs without a word, just watching his mother. I took the boy's hand and walked Sarah to the door, passing in front of Mark and his parents. He stood there, his gaze full of hate, but he didn't dare stop us. Before leaving, I stopped and looked at Mr. Richard. I spoke slowly but firmly. "Keep trusting your son. You'll see. One day you will regret this." He didn't answer. He just looked at me coldly, and Mrs. Teresa was still there, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she wanted to escape it all. A few days later, Sarah suddenly remembered she had left some important project documents from work, along with some of Ethan's school books, at the old house. The boy had a test soon, and Sarah was afraid he would be affected if he missed his books. I saw her wring her hands, hesitant. "Mom, I think I have to go back for them." I cut her off immediately. "No, honey, let me go. I don't want you to face Mark. I don't want you to set foot in that place that has become a nightmare." She looked at me, with a mix of gratitude and worry, then nodded and gave me the spare key. I drove to the familiar street, my heart pounding in my chest. I parked the car in a secluded spot. I watched from a distance and waited until I saw Mark's car leave. He usually left around that time, probably to meet his gambling friends or his loan sharks. When I was sure he was gone, I got out of the car. I gripped the key tightly and took a deep breath to calm myself. The white gate was still ajar, as if it still remembered the horror of the other day. I went in, avoiding looking at the withered bougainvillea, its broken branches still on the ground. Inside, the house was cold and messy. A smell of dampness mixed with stale tobacco turned my stomach. I went straight to Ethan's room, quickly gathered his school books and put them in a tote bag. I also took some of his favorite toys, hoping they would brighten his day a bit. As I was leaving, I passed Mark's home office, the room he always kept locked, as if hiding a secret. But that day, the door was just slightly open, a crack that seemed to invite me in. I was going to walk past, but something on the desk made me stop. Sarah's black briefcase, the one she used for her work papers, was open. I hesitated, feeling a voice inside me tell me I should check. I entered slowly, trying not to make a sound, as if afraid of waking something invisible. My eyes scanned Mark's desk, covered in messy papers, scattered pens, and then I saw them. 2 new folders, placed perfectly amidst the chaos. I picked up the first one, and my heart started to beat faster. It was a mutual divorce petition. I flipped it open to the last page, and when I saw the signature, Sarah Miller, written clearly, I felt my chest tighten, but something wasn't right. The handwriting was stiff, without Sarah's characteristic smoothness. I had seen her sign her name hundreds of times, from thank you cards to work contracts. This signature was not my daughter's. With trembling hands, I picked up the second folder. Mortgage agreement on land use and adjacent properties. As the debtor, Sarah was listed. As the creditor, a financial company I had never heard of. The signature was identical to the one on the previous document, cold and fake. I turned a few more pages, and then my blood ran cold. There was a draft sheet filled with repeated signatures of Sarah Miller, clumsy, unsure, like someone practicing to imitate her. Mark. He had forged my daughter's signature, not only to get custody of Ethan, but also the house she had earned with so much effort. I stood there, clutching the folders, feeling my blood boil. He hadn't just abused Sarah physically. He was planning to steal everything from her. I pulled out my phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break. I photographed every page of both documents, especially the signatures and the practice sheet. I tried to keep my hand steady, but with every click of the shutter, the rage and fear rose higher. If Mark showed up right then, I didn't know what might happen. When I finished, I carefully placed everything back where it was. I took Sarah's briefcase and Ethan's books and hurried out of the house. As I got in the car, I took a deep breath to calm down, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. I drove back, my mind reeling from what I had just discovered. I didn't say anything when I got home. I just handed the phone to Sarah and opened the photos I had taken. Sarah looked at the screen. Her face turned white. She shook her head over and over, her voice trembling. "I never signed this. Mom, how could he?" She didn't finish the sentence. She lowered her head, covering her face with her hands, her body shaking. I sat beside her, held her, feeling her helplessness and her pain, to help her calm down. I gave her a blank sheet of paper and a pen. "Honey, sign here," I asked her, my voice soft but firm. Sarah obeyed. Her signature, fluid and elegant, was completely different from the forgeries. 2 signatures, one real and one fake. 2 opposite worlds. One with my daughter's honesty, the other with Mark's cruelty. That afternoon, I didn't hesitate. I called an old friend who had worked in the legal field and asked her for the contact of a good lawyer specializing in family law. She recommended Mrs. Catherine Reeves, a lawyer known for her sharpness and dedication. We set up an appointment for the next morning. When we arrived at her office, I showed her the photos and told her the whole story. Mrs. Reeves examined each image. She compared the real and fake signatures. Then she looked up at us and said in a firm voice, "This is document forgery with the intent to appropriate assets. With this evidence, we can not only file for a unilateral divorce in Mrs. Miller's favor, but also press criminal charges against him." After the meeting with lawyer Catherine, I felt a small spark of hope light up inside me. Immediately, Mrs. Reeves sent an official notification to Mark, requesting a meeting to discuss the division of assets and the custody of Ethan. In the letter, she subtly hinted that we had damaging evidence. I thought it would be a direct hit, a way to make him back down. But I was wrong. That action was like sticking my hand in a hornet's nest. Mark didn't respond to the lawyer's letter. He remained silent, but it wasn't the silence of someone giving up. It was the silence before a storm. The next morning, when I went to the market as I did every day, Mrs. Rose, my neighbor, the one who always greeted me with a smile and asked about Ethan, looked at me with pity. Then she looked away, pretended not to see me, and hurried into her house. I stood there, in the middle of the market, with my basket in my hand, feeling as if an invisible hand was squeezing my chest. What was happening? I ran home, my heart full of anxiety. As soon as I walked in the door, my phone vibrated. It was Sarah. Her voice was trembling with panic, almost crying. "Mom, come back now. A coworker told me Mark went to my office and spoke to my boss." Sobbing. She told me Mark had cried in front of her boss, saying Sarah was suffering from severe postpartum depression, that her mental state was unstable, and that I, her own mother, had encouraged her to abandon her home. He said it with a pained voice, as if he were a desperate husband trying to save his family. I felt my blood boil. He dared to lie, to defame my daughter right at her workplace, where she had fought so hard to build her career. Before I could calm down, another call came in. This time it was from an employee at the Department of Social Services. Her cold voice asked me to come in to clarify possible acts of family interference and signs of separation between mother and child. They said they had received a medical certificate from Mark, assuring them that Sarah was unfit to care for Ethan due to psychological problems. I froze. The phone almost fell from my hands. Mark had gone much further than I imagined. He didn't just want to take her house in custody, he wanted to destroy her reputation, to make everyone believe Sarah was not a reliable mother. That afternoon I ran home, where Sarah and Ethan were. She was huddled on the sofa, hugging the boy tightly, her eyes swollen from crying so much. The little one, sensing the tension, was scribbling on a piece of paper, but his eyes never stopped watching his mother with worry. I sat next to her, trying to say something to comfort her, but suddenly the door opened. Mark came in, followed by two neighbors I knew well. He didn't cross the threshold. He stood in the doorway, playing his part perfectly. He wiped away fake tears and said in a trembling voice, "I just want my wife and son to come back to me. Sarah isn't well, but I will take care of her. Only my mother-in-law insists on destroying my family." The neighbors looked at me with suspicion and reproach. One of them, Anne, said to me with a compassionate tone, "Ma'am, you should let them fix their own problems. Fights between couples are normal. Getting involved only makes it worse." I wanted to scream, to tell them about the bruises on Sarah's arms, the forged signatures, the fear in Ethan's eyes, but I knew that even if I had 100 mouths, they wouldn't believe me. Mark had already turned me into the villain of the story. The pressure from work, from the neighbors, and now from social services, made Sarah break down completely. She barely spoke. She just sat, hugging Ethan as if afraid someone would snatch him away. That night, Mark returned. He handed Sarah a blister pack of pills, his voice soft but icy. "Take these, Sarah. They're vitamins the doctor prescribed. They'll help stabilize you. Do it. And everything will go back to how it was. If you don't, they'll think you really are sick, and they'll take Ethan away." I watched as my daughter, trembling, took the tranquilizer almost without realizing it. I felt my heart break. He wasn't just hurting her with words or violence. He was now poisoning her mind, making her doubt herself. As I was getting ready to leave, Mark stopped me in the yard. He wasn't shouting like before. His voice was cold as ice. "You see, you have evidence of forged signatures, but I have a medical document proving my wife isn't stable. Who do you think the court will believe?" He got close to my face with a threatening look. "If you don't bring Sarah and Ethan back here tomorrow, I will file a motion with the court asking for emergency custody of Ethan because his mother has mental problems and has been kidnapped by her grandmother. Then your daughter will lose everything." I looked into his cruel eyes and, for the first time, I felt at a disadvantage. He had calculated everything, from public opinion to the fake papers. I wanted to resist, to scream that I wouldn't let him win, but I knew that, in the current situation, I didn't have the strength. If he really filed the motion with lies and false documents, Sarah could lose Ethan. The thought paralyzed me. The next day, I swallowed my tears. I packed Sarah's and Ethan's things with my own hands and took them both back to that house. Sarah looked at me with eyes full of tears. "Mom, I don't want to go back." I hugged her tight and whispered, "Hold on, just a little longer, honey. I promise I will gather enough evidence to drag him down to the hell he himself created." As soon as I got back, I called lawyer Catherine, shaking. "Mrs. Reeves, I need a reliable private investigator. Mark is playing dirty, and I need proof to unmask him, Mrs. Reeves agreed immediately and promised to introduce me to someone experienced. I took out all the savings I had left, the money I had saved for years to protect myself, and contacted the private investigator Mrs. Reeves recommended. He, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze, promised to follow Mark's every move, especially to find the origin of the fake medical certificate he was using to slander Sarah. "Rest easy, I'll find the truth," he said in a low, confident voice. I nodded, but inside I couldn't stop worrying. While I waited, I tried to make everything seem normal. Every day I brought food to Sarah's house, a plate of homemade tamales, some soup, or just a box of fresh fruit. I told Mark it was to take care of Ethan, but really I was going to check if Sarah was safe. Every time I entered that house, my heart ached. The bougainvillea on the porch now only had a few thin branches, just like Sarah's spirit, worn down and battered. I secretly gave her a spare phone, hid it well in her blouse, and told her, "Keep this to call me if you need to. Don't let him see it." Sarah nodded, her eyes grateful but still full of fear. A week later, the detective called me. "Mrs. Linda, I have what you need," he said confidently. I met him in a small cafe on the outskirts, where no one paid us any attention. He handed me a small black USB drive and said, "This video was recorded from a distance. The quality isn't perfect, but it's enough to see what's happening." I clutched the USB like it was a silver bullet. When I got home, I plugged it into the computer, my heart racing. The video appeared, a bit blurry but clear enough. Mark was in the parking lot behind a private clinic, handing a thick envelope to a man in a worn-out white coat. The man nodded and handed Mark a batch of papers with a red seal. The detective also told me, "That man used to be a doctor, but his license was revoked 2 years ago for selling false documents." A chill ran down my spine. This was the proof I needed, the proof to unmask Mark's lie. The next morning, I took the USB and the photos of the forged signature to the police station. The officer who took my report listened to me carefully and took notes. "Mrs. Linda, with this evidence, we will open an investigation immediately," he said. I nodded, relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I thought that with a little more time, Mark would pay for what he did. That night, I drove to Sarah's house as usual, carrying a box of flan that Ethan likes. I felt a little lighter, thinking it was all going to end. But as I approached the gate, I heard a loud crash from inside, as if something heavy had collapsed. Then Mark's furious voice yelling, "You dare to report me! You want me to destroy you! Is that it?" His voice sounded like a beast's, and my heart sank. I ran inside, and, without thinking, the scene left me breathless. The glass dining table was overturned, fragments all over the floor. Sarah was hugging Ethan tightly, huddled in a corner, as if trying to protect him with her own body. Her face was pale, her eyes red, terrified. When he saw me, Mark became even more enraged. He threw everything off the coffee table, glasses, picture frames, a small vase, all shattered at his feet. "You too!" he yelled, pointing at me. "You think you can destroy my family." Ethan, seized by fear, broke free from his mother's arms, ran to his father, and clung to his legs, crying hysterically. "Dad, please, don't hurt Mom." The boy's voice trembled, begging for the impossible. But Mark, blinded by fury, didn't even look down. He kicked his leg hard to shake the boy off, as if he were just an obstacle. The push made Ethan lose his balance and fall backward. His head hit the sharp wooden edge of the coffee table. and the dull thud of the impact stole my breath. A second of icy silence filled the room. Then I saw a gash on Ethan's temple, and red blood began to ooze slowly, dripping onto the floor. I screamed, a scream that tore through my throat, as if all the pain inside me burst out at once. I ran towards him, without thinking, without fear, and with all my strength, I slapped Mark across the face. The sound echoed like an explosion, making him stagger. I didn't look at him again. I just scooped Ethan into my arms. The boy was fading, his eyes closed, his little face pale. "Ethan, it's me. Your grandma. Wake up, please." I called him, my voice broken with panic. I ran out into the street, screaming for an ambulance. Sarah followed me, crying, clutching her son in my arms. The neighbors started to come out, looking at us with a mix of curiosity and concern. I didn't care. I just wanted to save my grandson. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics quickly put him on a stretcher. I took Sarah's hand and got in with her. Before the door closed, I looked directly at Mark. He was standing there, paralyzed, with a vacant look, as if even he couldn't believe what had just happened. In a cold voice, I told him clearly, "I'll see you in court." That night, while Ethan was in the hospital, Sarah and I sat on hard plastic chairs in the cold hallway, the smell of disinfectant making me feel suffocated. Sarah huddled, hugging herself, her swollen eyes fixed on the emergency room door. The doctor came out, informed us that Ethan only had a mild concussion and needed 3 stitches, but luckily, he was not in danger. The boy had to stay for observation for a few days. I breathed a sigh of relief, but looking at Sarah, I knew she didn't feel at ease. Her eyes were still full of fear, as if expecting another storm to come. At the hospital, I called lawyer Catherine and the police to give my initial statement about the incident that injured Ethan. I took Sarah's hand and whispered, "I will not let him get away with this, honey. Never." The following days, I lived in a state between sleep and wakefulness, preparing for the trial. Every night I reviewed the photos of the fake signatures, the detective's video, and Catherine's notes. I thought that with this evidence, Mark would have no way to deny his guilt. But deep down, I was afraid. He was a cunning man, and I knew he wouldn't give up easily. The day of the trial arrived. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy and solemn. I sat next to Sarah, holding her cold hand. She wore a light blue blouse, trying to appear calm, but I could feel the tremor in her fingers. On the other side, Mark appeared in an impeccable suit, clean-shaven, looking more like a troubled businessman than a man who had destroyed his family. He sat next to his lawyer, muttering occasionally, with a cold but confident look. Behind him, Richard and Teresa, his parents, remained silent. Richard looked at us with contempt, as if I were responsible for ruining his family. Teresa kept her head down, avoiding my gaze, her hands tightly clasped. Lawyer Catherine began with relentless confidence. She presented the photographs of the forged signatures on the divorce papers and the home mortgage, pointing out every suspicious detail in the handwriting. "This constitutes an intentional act of fraud for the purpose of appropriating my client's assets," she said in a firm voice that echoed in the room. I looked at Mark and saw him give a slight smile, showing no concern. His lawyer stood up, speaking calmly but slyly. "My client, Mr. Mark, acted solely in the best interest of his family. Mrs. Miller, in an unstable emotional state, gave him verbal consent to sign these documents on her behalf. He was only trying to assume family responsibility." I squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling my blood boil. Verbal consent, emotionally unstable. How dare he turn my daughter into a weak woman? Incapable of deciding for her own life, I wanted to scream. But Catherine signaled me to stay calm. She continued her presentation and showed the detective's video, where Mark was seen handing an envelope of money to a supposed unlicensed doctor in exchange for a fake medical certificate. "This is clear proof of premeditated fraud," she stated firmly. Mark's team didn't flinch. His lawyer admitted his client had been naive, but argued he did it out of sincere concern for his wife's health. They painted him as a confused husband, tricked by a fake doctor. I looked at Sarah. She was biting her lip, fighting back tears. I knew what she was thinking. All her pain, her nights of crying, the threats, now twisted into a completely different story. When Catherine mentioned the incident that left Ethan injured, I thought it would be the decisive blow. She described in detail how Mark caused Ethan to fall, making the boy hit his head against the table. But Mark's lawyer objected immediately, calling it an unfortunate accident in the midst of a family dispute. They said Ethan must have accidentally gotten between his parents while they were arguing and fell on his own. "There are no objective witnesses other than Mrs. Linda and Miss Sarah," his lawyer said sarcastically. "Their statements are clearly subjective." I couldn't take it anymore. In a last-ditch effort, I pulled up Sarah's sleeve, revealing the bruises that were already starting to turn yellow and green on my daughter's thin arm. I stood up, my voice trembling but growing louder. "Your Honor, this is not an accident. This is what he did to my daughter." The whole room fell silent. All eyes turned to Sarah, but the judge slammed his gavel. His cold voice cut through. "The bruises do not have a medical report from the time of the incidents. The court cannot admit them as valid proof of acts of violence." I sank back into my seat, feeling the floor open up beneath me. I looked at Mark and saw a smirk on his lips. He thought he was going to get away with it, that he would just have to pay a small fine for forging documents, and that the acts of violence would be erased. Custody of Ethan in the house could still be disputed. Sarah squeezed my hand tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. I wanted to hug her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't. The judge's words resonated, rhythmic, like blows burying our hopes. With the current evidence, the court finds there is insufficient basis to conclude the existence of intentional violence. In that moment, I felt that justice had turned its back on us. I had forgotten that to convict someone like Mark, you need cold, irrefutable proof. Not just the invisible wounds of the soul. Just as the judge cleared his throat, about to issue the final ruling, the screech of a chair scraping the floor sounded sharp and sudden, breaking the oppressive silence. All eyes turned. Mrs. Teresa, Mark's mother, was slowly getting to her feet. Her face was soaked in tears. Her hands gripped her purse with such force that her knuckles turned white. I looked at her, surprised, my heart pounding. Mrs. Teresa, who had always been silent, who had always bowed her head to her husband and son, was now standing there, her shoulders trembling, but her gaze resolute. Mr. Richard, sitting next to her, yanked hard on his wife's sleeve and hissed through his teeth. "What are you doing, Teresa? Sit down now." His voice was full of anger, trying to subdue her. But Mrs. Teresa, with a small but decisive gesture, pulled her arm away from her husband's hand. That gesture astonished me. I had never seen her rebel. I had never seen her stand up to Mr. Richard. She looked directly at the judge, her voice trembling but clear, every word carved from her heart. "Your Honor, I have proof." The courtroom stirred. Some whispered. Curious glances turned toward her. The judge frowned and motioned for her to approach the stand. Mrs. Teresa moved forward, her legs unsteady as if every step was a struggle. As she walked, she spoke, her voice breaking. "I know my son. He is just like his father. A few weeks ago, when I went to watch Ethan, the boy told me he saw his father push his mother. I dismissed it. I told him not to say such silly things, but the fear in his eyes haunted me, day after day. My heart ached hearing that. Ethan, my dear little grandson, had tried to tell the truth. But it was his own grandmother who didn't believe him. I looked at Sarah and saw her press her lips together, her eyes glistening, Mrs. Teresa stopped in front of the stand, opened her purse with trembling hands, and took out a small black USB drive. She handed it to the court officer. her voice low but firm. "I bought a hidden camera. I put it inside an old teddy bear on the living room shelf. I just wanted to know the truth, and I saw everything." My heart beat harder as the officer connected the USB. The large screen in the courtroom lit up, and the room fell silent. The first video appeared. Mark in the living room, throwing a stack of papers in Sarah's face, yelling at her. "Sign it, you useless. If you don't blame me." His voice was harsh, threatening. Sarah cringed. She tried to dodge him, but he wouldn't stop. The second clip took my breath away. Mark grabbing Sarah by the hair. He forced her head down against the table, his face contorted with rage. In the video, Ethan's cry could be heard, faint but heartbreaking. "Dad, don't hurt Mom." The third clip, with crystal clear sound, was a stab at the previous lies. "You think your mother is going to save you? I will make your whole family live worse than the dead." Every scene, every word, was irrefutable proof. It was no longer an accident. It was no longer sincere concern, as Mark's lawyer tried to present. It was a threat, systematic and cruel. I looked at Mark. I saw him sitting, frozen in his chair, his face as pale as paper. He wasn't smiling anymore. His panicked gaze shifted from his mother to me, as if desperately looking for a way out. In the courtroom, Mr. Richard jumped to his feet, pointed at his wife, and shouted, "You damned woman traitor!" His voice was full of fury, but the bailiffs immediately approached and ordered him to maintain order and sit down. Mrs. Teresa didn't look at him. She just stood there, her trembling hands clutching her purse, as tears streamed down her face. In her gaze, I saw not only pain but also relief, as if she had just freed herself from a burden that had crushed her for years. The judge struck the gavel hard on the desk. His voice rang out, firm, without a trace of doubt. "Based on the new evidence presented, this court finds the defendant, Mark, guilty of the crimes of domestic violence, assault and battery, document forgery, and fraud." He paused, looked directly at him, and continued. "The divorce petition from Mrs. Miller is approved immediately. She is granted full custody of the minor, Ethan, and full ownership of the house." I felt the world move slowly. Sarah squeezed my hand hard, tears falling down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief. 2 police officers approached and handcuffed Mark right there in the courtroom. As they led him away, he looked at his mother and then at me, with a mix of hatred and desperation. I didn't look at him anymore. I turned to Mrs. Teresa, who was standing there, crying silently, her small shoulders shaking like a leaf in the wind. In that instant, I understood that she had not only saved my daughter and my grandson, but she was also trying to save herself. A few weeks after the trial, Sarah and Ethan moved into my small house on the outskirts of the city. Ethan's laughter, though still timid, began to fill the house and bring back its warmth. I did everything possible to create a safe space for them both. I cooked Sarah's favorite dishes. I played with Ethan. But I knew the wounds of the soul would take time to heal. At night, when everyone was asleep, I sometimes heard Sarah sobbing from her room. Other times, Ethan would wake up startled, screaming his mother's name, his eyes wide with fear. We changed all the locks on Sarah's old house and hired someone to clean up the mess Mark had left. The bougainvillea on the porch began to bloom again, but Sarah wasn't ready to go back yet. "Mom, I just can't yet," she told me. In a near whisper, "Every corner reminds me of him." I nodded without pushing. I knew that even though the house now belonged to her on paper, it was still loaded with the ghosts of those darkest days. I just wished that one day she could feel safe in her own home again. One weekend afternoon, while I was on the porch helping Ethan color a picture of superheroes, the doorbell rang. I stood up, wiped my hands on my apron, thinking maybe it was Mrs. Rose, the neighbor who sometimes brought fruit. But when I opened the door, I froze. It was Mrs. Teresa, Mark's mother. She looked like she had aged 10 years. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face more drawn than ever. In her hands, she held a box of pastries and a new toy robot, the kind Ethan had always wanted. She looked at me, her voice trembling, almost afraid of being rejected. I just wanted to see how Ethan is. If this is a bad time, I can go. I looked at the woman in front of me, the same one who had the courage to show up in court and offer the evidence that saved my family. In her gaze, I saw remorse, but also a sincerity that was impossible to deny. I stepped back, opened the door wide, and said softly, "Please come in, Mrs. Teresa." She entered slowly, clutching the box of pastries as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. I made 2 cups of tea and invited her to sit in the living room. Sarah came out of her room. Seeing Mrs. Teresa, she paused for a moment, surprised, but then she nodded and gave a slight smile. Mrs. Teresa handed the robot to Ethan, speaking sweetly. "This is for you, Ethan. I know you like robots." The boy took it shyly, looked at his mother for permission, and then went to a corner to play quietly with his new toy. We sat, and although the atmosphere was a bit awkward at first, Mrs. Teresa was the first to speak, her voice heavy with guilt. "Mrs. Linda, Sarah, I am sorry. I am sorry for everything Mark did to you." She paused, took a deep breath, as if gathering all the courage she had left. "My husband, Richard, he hurt me for 30 years. I froze, the teacup trembling in my hands. Mrs. Teresa told me, her voice shaking, that every time Mr. Richard lost money gambling or drank too much, he took his anger out on her. The beatings always happened behind a closed door, where no one could see. Mark, since he was little, witnessed how his father used his fists to solve everything. He learned from his father, she said, tears running down her cheeks. I saw Mark changing, how he started to become like Richard, but I didn't have the courage to face him. I was afraid that by admitting it, I would also have to accept that I failed as a mother. She took my hands. They were ice cold, but full of strength. At first, I was silent out of shame. Then, I was silent for my children, for what they call family honor. I convinced myself that if I just endured, everything would get better. But when I saw Sarah, when I saw the bruises on her arms, identical to the ones I used to have, I understood I was wrong. My silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was only feeding another monster. She turned to Sarah, her eyes full of remorse. "It was you who gave me courage, Sarah, seeing you fight, even though you were scared, even though you were in pain. I understood I couldn't keep living in that hell. If I kept silent, Ethan would grow up and become another Mark, or even worse, another Richard." She paused. Her voice broke. "After the trial, I packed my things and left home. I'm filing for divorce from Richard. I don't want to live another day in fear." I looked at her, feeling my heart melt. The woman in front of me was no longer the mother of a man who had caused harm, but a mother, a wife who had suffered too much and was now trying to right her wrongs. I took her hands and squeezed them gently, my voice breaking. "You didn't just save my daughter, Mrs. Teresa. You also saved your grandson and yourself." Sarah moved closer slowly and sat next to Mrs. Teresa. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on her shoulder and then hugged her. The 3 of us, 3 women, 3 generations, 3 stories of pain. We stayed there, holding each other, sharing the same silent understanding. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of liberation, of hope. 6 months have passed since Mark was taken away in handcuffs. My daughter's life and mine have started to find their course, like a small boat finally finding a calm harbor after the storm. My house, which once only knew the silence of an old woman, is now filled with Ethan's laughter and Sarah's stories. Sarah went back to her job at the company, the same place where she feared Mark would destroy her reputation. But she achieved the opposite. With hard work and talent, she not only kept her position, but was promoted to project manager. I see she's different. She's no longer the timid, fearful woman from before. Now she speaks with confidence, with a spark in her eyes every time she tells me her new plans. "Mom, I want to build a beautiful future for Ethan," she told me once while we were having dinner. I smiled and stroked her hair, full of pride. Ethan has also regained his bright smile. The small scar on his temple, a reminder of that terrible day, has faded, leaving only a faint line under his dark hair. He no longer wakes up startled in the night, although sometimes I see him hug his teddy bear tightly, with a slight fear when he hears strange noises. I often sit by his side and tell him stories about superheroes. He laughs and asks me, "Grandma, are you a superhero because you saved me and Mom?" In those moments, I just hug him and whisper, "I'm not a superhero, sweetie, but I will always be here with you." Sarah decided not to sell the old house, even though I suggested a fresh start might be better. "That house is ours, Mom," she told me firmly. "Why should we have to leave because of what he did?" I understood her decision, and together we began to renovate it. We painted the walls a warm yellow, replacing the old, faded mint green. We cleaned the broken glass, threw away the wedding photos, and hung up drawings made by Ethan. Little by little, the house began to breathe life again, as if it too were healing, along with Sarah and her son. Sometimes I hear news about Mark from former neighbors. He was released early for good behavior, but his life became a hell. Without a job, without a home, he went back to live with Richard in the old family house. Father and son sank into alcohol and gambling, drowning in debt. I was told that creditors visit them often, throwing red paint on the walls and writing threats in chalk. They live in hiding, afraid to see anyone, like ghosts in the world they themselves created. I don't feel satisfaction, just a slight sadness, not for Mark, but for everything he himself destroyed. Mrs. Teresa, or as we all affectionately call her now, Mama Teresa, has become an essential part of our family. After the trial, she completed her divorce from Mr. Richard, received a portion of the assets, and bought a small apartment not far from my house. She comes by almost every afternoon, helping Sarah pick up Ethan from school or bringing over a plate of homemade cookies. Ethan adores her and always brags to his friends that he has 2 wonderful grandmothers. Sarah calls her Mama Teresa and treats her like a second mother. With an affection and respect I had never seen her show anyone but me. Mrs. Teresa and I became confidants. We cook together, share old recipes, and tend to the small garden behind my house. Once, while we were pulling weeds, she looked at me smiling and said, "Mrs. Linda, I never thought I'd have a friend at this age." I laughed and replied, "Mrs. Teresa, I never thought I'd find someone who understood me like you do either." Those moments, though simple, were the remedy we both needed to heal. One beautiful Sunday morning, I was sitting on the balcony, sipping a hot cup of tea as the first rays of sun filtered through the leaves of the trees. Down in the yard, Sarah and Mrs. Teresa were tending the bougainvillea in front of the house together. That same plant that had been trampled on that terrible day had now come back to life. They cut the dry branches, tying up the new shoots that were reaching high, with the delicacy of someone caring for something sacred. On the vine that once looked withered, pink and purple buds were beginning to open, shining in the morning light like small, vibrant flames. I watched those 2 women, one who had given birth to the man who caused so much harm, and one who was his victim. Together, they had been through hell, enduring unimaginable pain, and now they were there, side by side, cultivating life from the ashes. Sarah looked up, saw me on the balcony, and smiled as she said, "Mom, come down and see. The flowers are beautiful." Mrs. Teresa also looked up, with a kind smile on her lips. "Linda, if you don't come down, I'm going to plant your whole garden myself." I put down my teacup, went down to the yard, my heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. As I looked at the blooming bougainvillea, I knew that Sarah's and Ethan's future, just like those flowers, could only be bright and full of life. In this life, there are invisible wounds that leave deeper scars than any knife. After everything that happened, I understood that a mother's silence can be the very thing that lets evil grow in the darkness. If I had not stood up, if Mrs. Teresa had not found the courage to face the truth, the violence, the lies, and the fear, they would have continued to repeat. From husband to son, and from son to grandson, I want everyone, especially women, to remember this. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting even while you are trembling. Justice may be slow, but it never stays silent forever. And sometimes, true liberation isn't in punishing the guilty, but in daring to forgive yourself for enduring so much for so long. The story you have just heard has had names and places changed to protect the identities of those involved. We don't tell it to judge, but in the hope that someone will listen and reflect. How many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own homes, I truly wonder. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose silence to keep the peace, or confront everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story can be a candle that lights the path for someone else. God always blesses, and I am sure that bravery will lead us to better days. Right now, on the end screen, I will leave 2 of the channel's most beloved stories. I am sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.